you don't protect democracy by delivering these norm core lectures about the importance of the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court, because the number of people who care about those institutions is relatively little. You protect democracy by protecting people against the power grab of power-hungry economic and political elites. That's where the Hungarian opposition really failed. And this new center-right organization or figure appears to be more efficient in talking about some of these challenges.
These days, a lot of people are wondering what can be done to prevent American democracy from backsliding into authoritarianism. 15 years ago, people in Hungary were asking themselves the same question. Today, we'll find out what Hungarians wish they'd known back then that could help the U.S. today. You're listening to The Context. It's a show from the Charles F. Kettering Foundation about how to get democracy to work for everyone and why that's so hard to do. I'm your host, Alex Lovit. Today, I'm speaking with Gábor Scheiring. He's a professor of comparative politics at Georgetown University, Qatar, and he's a global fellow here at the Kettering Foundation. In 2010, Gábor was elected to Hungarian Parliament. That same year, Viktor Orbán was re-elected as Hungary's Prime Minister, a position Orbán still holds to this day. So Gábor had a front row seat while Orbán dismantled Hungary's democratic institutions, with the help of Orbán's political party, Fidesz. Gábor says the U.S. should look to Hungary as a cautionary tale for what can happen if Americans don't act now to change the way we think about and talk about democracy. Gábor Scheiring, welcome to The Context.
Thanks for having me.
During the Cold War, Hungary was a communist nation in the orbit of the Soviet Union, but it's been holding regular elections since 1990. So is Hungary a democracy?
At the moment, I don't think Hungary is a democracy. It was a democracy before, but soon after Viktor Orbán was elected for a second consecutive term, sometime around that time in 2014, I think Hungary stopped being a proper democracy. And it's a form of competitive authoritarian regime. If you want a more popular version of it, it's more of a zombie democracy. It pretends to be a democracy, but it's dead inside.
Well, let's drill down into that a little bit, because I think for Americans, it's sometimes hard to understand what it looks like for a democracy to decline. So if I go to Hungary today, I'm going to see elections. I think the votes in those elections are mostly counted fairly. I'm going to see opposition parties, but if all that's going on, then how isn't it a democracy?
This is a really good question, because many of us used to think of the end of democracies using more kind of historical parallels. Democracies kind of die under the fire of the tanks of wannabe autocratic leaders, and then democracy is over like that. But really, that's not how democracies die these days. Sometimes this more straightforward version still applies, but in most cases, we have this more incremental procedure that political scientists call democratic backsliding. So it's a set of incremental tweaks that kind of eradicate the social foundations of democracy. They sort of hollow the institutions. They maintain an institutional facade like elections, or there's a set of competing parties. There are institutions like judiciary. There might be a degree of free media. It's not completely impossible, but very, very difficult to get rid of the ruling political party or personality. But really, the degree of competition is not fair, and resources are extremely centralized in the hands of the governing party, that the competition is just extremely unfair.
Can you give me a sense of what that looks like on the ground? If I'm a Hungarian citizen who's critical of the government, what restrictions might I experience, and how might I experience the sort of lack of ability to influence change?
That's why this is more challenging to see, and especially for people, for regular citizens to recognize, because they won't necessarily recognize many significant changes in the day-to-day lives. I mean, there are still competing political parties, but if they pay close attention, then they won't see those competing political parties to an equal degree. So, for example, political parties would face in Hungary these random fines that would, in the case of some of the smaller parties, put them basically on the verge of financial bankruptcy. Now, they don't ban these parties, but if you are financially bankrupt, how are you supposed to compete? So that's just one element. The judiciary is controlled more from the top. The public prosecutor's office is run by a close loyalist and friend and ally of Viktor Orbán. So there are procedures, sometimes important procedures, but when it comes to politically relevant procedures that would go after grand corruption organized by Viktor Orbán and his party and key allies, the public prosecutor will never go after those cases.
So it sounds like then democracy can be suppressed not by a kind of totalitarian oppression of the average citizen, but rather by controlling what might be called elites of other political parties, of media, of the judiciary. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. So you won't see policemen or the military standing next to the polling stations. They won't tell you how to vote. But there are these subtle, or in some cases not so subtle, ways of controlling the flow of information. Friendly oligarchs, the Hungarian versions of Elon Musk and the like, played a really important role in buying up, especially local media outlets, television stations, print media, tabloid media. So if you want to get local news, you would get it from media outlets that are one way or another affiliated with Fidesz. And you can see this happening also in the United States, where there's this erosion, especially of local media sources available. So at the local level, the diversity of information is much less pronounced. So that's a crucial part of the story.
So let me ask a little bit about your own experience. You've served in the Hungarian Parliament, so you've been a part of the democracy, and now you're saying that the country is no longer democratic. What has your experience been like? Was there a moment when you kind of realized, we're in trouble here?
I think me and the Green Party group that I was a member of, we realized the threats to Hungarian democracy fairly early on. And we even organized a massive demonstration around the Hungarian Parliament, basically a living chain, where we blocked the entrance route to the building of the Parliament during a critical day when, with the help of Fidesz MPs, the Parliament voted for a series of laws that started to dismantle the basic institutions of democracy. So this was just the day before Christmas, as it happens in Hungary. So December the 23rd, we chained ourselves to the entrance of the Parliament. And that kicked off a quite significant set of demonstrations in Budapest. But I have to say that at that point, the majority of Hungarians still believe that at the end of the day, Viktor Orbán wants to bring a new era that will benefit the majority of Hungarians. And they had very bad memory with the transition era, mostly led by liberal parties, leading to significant social and economic problems. And Viktor Orbán was riding the economic anger to get elected to power. And this is, like in the case of the US and many other instances, we see how these illiberal leaders are getting elected by riding the wave of these electoral frustrations. And then it's a problem if you have a large segment of the population that did not perceive liberal democracy as something that would perform and protect the rights of everyday citizens. Then at the end of the day, there are a large number of citizens who's like, why should I care about liberal democracy if liberal democracy didn't care about me?
With the benefit of hindsight, do you think there is something that could have been done? If you could go back to 2010 and 2011 now, would you do things differently?
I think one of the biggest mistakes of the opposition was the failure to organize a clear majority and too much focus on some of the institutional issues that are super relevant for the functioning of healthy democracies, but you don't protect democracy by delivering these norm core lectures about the importance of the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court, because the number of people who care about those institutions is relatively little. You need to organize a majority based on issues that people really care about. And I think that's where the Hungarian opposition really failed. And there were several instances where there were fairly spontaneous opposition movements arising from the streets, basically. And then leading figures of the opposition committed these tactical mistakes of kind of diverting the oppositional energies away from labor issues, for example, to issues related to institutions, rule of law, media, and these sort of things. I'm not saying again that these things are not important. They are very important, but they are not issues based on which you can build a majoritarian identity to protect democracy. You protect democracy by protecting people against the power grab of power-hungry economic and political elites.
One way of thinking about that is through narrative, that there's a narrative that right-wing populists are telling, and potentially there are alternative narratives that the opposition should be offering. So how do you think about, how should the opposition think in terms of narrative and identity? What should be being offered to the public?
I think too often these forces of democracy have become reactive. They come across as political forces that are only interested in protecting the status quo, and they don't really offer any transformative narratives or visions that would lead from the current status quo that many people find deeply disillusioning to a kind of a new political and economic arrangement that offers new hope, renewed chances for mobility, renewed chances for inclusion, for more social justice, where economic and political elites cannot just grab whatever resources they find. And unfortunately, it's authoritarian populists, especially right-wing liberal populists, that have managed, in a completely fake way, by the way, it's a very fake identity, but they have managed to kind of occupy this political space where they appear as the forces of change with narratives about how they are going to give back power to the people, how they're going to increase their control over those uncaring elites. And this is the deep fundamental problem. When democracy, liberalism, social democracy was working up until, let's say, the 70s, 80s, it was working pretty well across Europe. It used to be a political force, a political home that had a vision about how to change the economic system in a way that leads to a more equal distribution of resources, that gives power to people. And this has really gone away. So that's a major problem. As the left has moved to the center, or liberals have moved to the kind of the political center and have become really the forces of the status quo, there you can see the space opening up, especially among lower income citizens, working class citizens. It's the same story in the US, it's the same story in Europe, it's the same story in France, in Germany. It's especially working class citizens, lower middle class citizens that tend to be more disillusioned with the system, whose real wages in all of these countries have more or less stagnated. If you are a German citizen without a college degree, your real wage has not grown in the last couple of decades. It's the same as in the US. In Hungary, the average real wage, just when Viktor Orbán took power in 2010, was only like 10% higher or 13% higher than it was at the end of the 70s. So that's like basically the beginning of the last decade of state socialism. And that's the average. And, like inequalities have skyrocketed in the 90s. So when you have that situation and there's no kind of progressive alternative that would narrate these stories in a way that resonates with people's social and economic frustrations, then you will have Donald Trump is always ready to jump into the garbage truck and pretend that he's this folksy outsider. Even though he's a billionaire, he pretends to be a folksy outsider who goes against these nasty bureaucrats who are kind of just stealing money and just grabbing power for themselves. That's the narrative that they are selling. And this is working because there are real social and economic problems. There's real economic anger among people. There's real frustration, very legitimate frustration on the one hand. But there's also the lack of a democratic alternative that would address these problems. So you both have the social and economic or structural problems, but you also have the strategic failure of the democratic forces that then allow the liberal leaders to capitalize on these problems. And then, once they are elected to power, they will use that power in most cases to entrench themselves in power. Political scientists also call this executive aggrandizement, which is about increasing the power of the executive over the rest of the political apparatus. And then they would go after the bureaucracy, the career bureaucrats, the administration. They would go after human-centered ministries. You can see in the case of the US pretty well how they are about to dismantle the whole education department. Orbán did the same. We'd go after organized labor, all these sorts of institutional channels that one way or another help lower income citizens to organize themselves. Like in the case of Hungary, teachers cannot demonstrate anymore. They cannot join trade unions because once they do that, they risk being fired. And in the US, public service unions have also become the most important unions. So it's very important how the education sector is being controlled.
It sounds like you have a lot of sympathy for working class people who might be voting for Fidesz. How should the opposition or the left or liberals be thinking about working class folks that are voting for these populist parties?
I think one big mistake is to try to find the populist voter. That's very often a mistake committed by scholars of populism. They are out there to find the populist voter. But there's not one single type of populist voter. So, yes, there is a fairly large number of people who are deeply into nationalism and racism for cultural reasons. They hate migrants. But there's also a very large group, and this is what's really making illiberals competitive. There is a very large group who's kind of drifting between social democratic parties, left-wing parties, and these populist parties based on their economic appeal. And one of the biggest problems with democratic and liberal elites in the past couple of decades has been that they lost their ability to listen to and understand these people. So very often they jump to these conclusions that all of them are just racists, all of them are stupid, they are unworthy of listening to, they are unworthy of our representation. And this is a big mistake because this really leaves no other choice for these people but to seek the representation on the other side, on the illiberal side of the political spectrum. Yes, I am in many ways sympathetic to these people, not all of them, and I don't agree with what the illiberal political forces are proposing to these people, but I think it's really important to see that a large part of this is happening because these people have no alternatives. I'm coming from a working class family. I lived this through my family. How my father always used to say I would vote for a social democratic party if there were any in Hungary, but there's none. So he ended up being a Fidesz sympathizer. And then I researched this topic. I campaigned throughout these rural mid-sized towns in Hungary among these working class people. Many of them used to be left-wing voters in the 90s or early 2000s. And some of them, they just simply stopped voting. Others have shifted to the right. But there's also this generational element where the elderly would just stop voting and their sons and daughters would directly shift more to the radical right. So yes, I lived through this, I researched this, and I think there is a significant lack here among educated democratic and liberal elites in their ability to listen to and their willingness to represent these people.
Let me run through a few comparisons between the United States and Hungary, or places where I think there might be similar things to talk about. For one, Republicans currently have complete control of federal government here in the United States. White House, House, Senate, Supreme Court. Their electoral majority is not large. I mean, in fact, it's not even a majority in some cases. It's a plurality. That's also somewhat true in Hungary, I believe, where Fidesz does not have a huge majority of voters, but they do have a huge majority of parliament. Can you describe a little bit how that plays out in Hungary, how a small majority is translated into overwhelming control of government?
While it is true that Fidesz has not been extremely popular socially and politically in terms of the number of votes that it gained, Fidesz has used its power to restructure the constitution, to restructure the institutional landscape so that one vote for Fidesz carries more weight than one vote for the opposition. The tricks to the media landscape, they wrote a completely new constitutional system. All these elements served the purpose of translating a not so overwhelming electoral result into an overwhelming parliamentarian majority. In the case of the US, I mean, the political situation is much more balanced. And that's why I always like to stress that although its situation is pretty horrible, it's also important to realize in a federal system like the US, it's just much more difficult than it is in a unitary and much smaller country like Hungary.
So it sounds like you're saying that the U.S. may be protected somewhat by our federal system, by how hard it is to amend our constitution.
I'm not sure I would use protected at this moment in time, because I think the house is on fire and we need to panic. And I don't think the US is protected. But what I would say is that the opposition, or the democratic opposition in the US, still has time to fight back and slow down this process, because simply by the design of the American political system, it takes more time for Trump to get to where Orbán has gotten within a few years' time.
Well, so what I want to ask is, are there lessons that we can learn from Hungary? Are there changes that we should be looking out for right now, for Americans who want to protect our democratic way of life?
So it's really a full frontal attack that Trump has carried out in multiple dimensions at the same time. The administrative shock therapy has been pretty well described in Project 2025. Russ Vogt himself has repeatedly used the term shock therapy.
One of the primary authors of Project 2025.
Yeah, and he is one of the key allies of President Trump in implementing this institutional shock therapy. I think he's at the, how do you call it, the Office of...
OMB, Office of Management and Budget.
Yeah, that's it. And the way it's been employed to take control over the administration and entrench loyalists within the administration and get rid of the more independent-minded employees, it's just also very similar to what Viktor Orbán was doing. So I think following that and trying to fight that also legally is going to be really important. The whole situation with the media is, of course, super important. And if you know anyone who has some money to invest, I think one of the best ways to invest it would be non-Trump aligned, widely available, locally oriented tabloid media that people across the US can read, and it's not going to underpin Trump's narratives. It's really important also to protect the New York Times or the Atlantic. Probably these are going to survive, but the majority of people who would want local media or who want tabloid as opposed to highbrow educated news sources, they have much less choice. And so that's really crucial. And tracking how Trump is consolidating his alliance with tech billionaires is really, really important. We've seen the same taking place in Hungary. Orbán is very often described as a person who is only out there to kind of steal money and give it to his members of family and close friends, which is absolutely true. It's part of the picture. But unfortunately, the system is more stable because he has a much wider network of businessmen, economic elites, including foreign investors, that thought, well, we have this strong man in power. He's good at going after labor unions. He's making production cheaper. He's reducing taxes for us. So it's not our first choice. He's not the same kind of guy that we would maybe elect to represent our interests, but we are still quite happy with what he's doing. So I can see that the same kind of oligarchic alliance coming together in the US, and tracking that and trying to break that up is extremely important. Again, Viktor Orbán's stability in part depends on the support that he got from a wide network of domestic businesses, not just the corrupt oligarchs, but a much wider network, but also from German corporations, car manufacturing companies. You know which country has the lowest taxation rate across the OECD when it comes to corporate taxes? It's Hungary. Trump has announced that the US would not only withdraw from the WHO and from the Paris Climate Accord, but it would also withdraw from the OECD agreement on global corporate taxation. That would set a minimum global corporate tax rate. Before Trump, there was one guy who was fighting extremely hard against that global agreement. His name was Viktor Orbán. So I really want to stress this because there is this misunderstanding in political science that that economic elites are by default on the side of the rule of law and democracy. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they are among the most important allies. But very often their maneuvering is more tactical. And if they have something to gain financially, unfortunately, they are ready to give up on these basic principles. So that, I would say, is also really important to track and deal with. But if I can back to what the most important thing is really for liberal and democratic groups to learn to construct a symbolically appealing identity that gives voice to a majority of Americans. And that really requires a fundamental reset of what it means to be a liberal in the contemporary context.
Yeah, well, on the capitalist front, I'll say I've been concerned about democracy in the United States lately. And I've had some thought of like, well, there's just too much money involved in the American system for it to be, it won't be allowed to collapse. The capitalists will save democracy in the end. And then I read your book, and now I'm not so sure.
Unfortunately, yes. I'm sorry if the book was disillusioning in that dimension. But really, if you follow Jeff Bezos just announcing how he would restructure the opinion pages of the Washington Post, just one example. And you could track how this scary alliance has come together in support of Donald Trump. In many ways, it's also an interesting alliance because previously we would have believed that tech capital would be more aligned with liberal forces. So it was more like categorized as a progressive kind of capital. But we can see now that it's not true. That if, for example, the European Union announces that it wants to regulate the information flow on social media platforms, then suddenly these oligarchs owning these social media platforms are really happy if an illiberal strongman in the White House is representing their interests. But we also learned that this tech capital really needs a lot of energy. And Trump's pivot back to fossil fuels and cheap energy domestically is really something that the tech capital also needs to maintain the whole network of internet with the data centers and AI and the computational capacity needed for that. And again, this is something that I don't think has received enough attention.
So let me ask about a couple other, potential similarities between Hungary and the United States. So in addition to being a former legislator, you're also a professor. And I know Orbán has attacked higher education in certain ways in Hungary. I have two questions. One is, how has that attack taken place? And the other is why? Why was it important to him to go after higher ed?
I think the reasons are really similar in the US and in Hungary. Higher education is an important institutional source for independent thinking and independent research. It's not true that higher education in general is always more necessarily liberally oriented. But it's certainly true that if you have a highly illiberal conservative party, then the university sector and the whole higher education sector is really not the sphere that would be the most receptive to that kind of conservative politics. And it's also true that university students have always tended to lean more towards the liberal than the conservative side. So for all these reasons, if you are this wannabe autocrat, one of the first things that you would want to do is to rein in the independence of universities. And this really fits well Orbán's power strategy. It's the cultural hegemony in addition to the economic hegemony. There was also an American university in a country, by the way, called Central European University. I don't know if you've been following that story. Viktor Orbán had this very choreographed conflict with that particular American university, and they just basically ended up kicking it out. So the university has relocated to Vienna. I mean, it's a top university. It was the only university in the country which was recognized, for example, in political sciences. It was in the top 50 globally. Now it's a university in Vienna. That's also because that was a private institution. Orbán had no control over it, and it employed quite a few intellectuals and produced young graduates who were not necessarily buying Viktor Orbán's messages. So it's the same story in the US. We have just seen how Trump is going really, really hard after universities. So it's a direct attempt to control universities from the top.
We've been talking for a long time about some pretty complex problems. Let's give at least a little bit of time to talk about solutions. What is your advice for Hungarian citizens who want to restore democracy in their country? What can they do?
I mean, the case of Hungary has become really peculiar politically just very recently, because the problems with the opposition that I've been referring to have accumulated to a degree that almost all of these political forces have vanished. And now, just a year ago, an ex-ally of Viktor Orbán has quit Fidesz and put together a new center-right political party, which is very new, and it's shiny, and it's now really attracting quite a bit of support from the Hungarian people. So it might have a chance to give a hard time to Viktor Orbán. Beyond that, the most important thing is, if you are organizing, I think the most important thing is always to keep your eye on issues that lend themselves to organize from the local levels ground up to national kind of majorities. And don't let the organization splinter into these factional issues or issues that are crucial about institutions, but they should not take center stage in the organizational work. The organizational work or the identity building should really roll around things that show people that democracy delivers, so that they really can trust democracy as a system that is about people and not just about elites. And I think that's also perhaps one of the most important things for the US. But of course, in the US, it's in many ways a different society. So I think litigation is also an important part of defending democracy. So those legal procedures can slow down Trump. And I think identifying them and identifying potential legal avenues is going to be really, really important. At the same time, I think that if you look back, legal procedures against Trump are not new. And the guy has really successfully survived all of them. And if you only concentrate on the legal procedure, that again, if you just look at this from a political perspective, it creates the opposition that there is this elite that is going after the friend of the population, a friend of the people. So it just reinforces this kind of populistic divide between the technocratic elites and the friend of the people, the people's candidate. So I think that's why the legal pathway has to be combined with an identity building that really attracts the majority. I would also draw a line again and to draw attention again to the importance of trying to break this alliance that runs from disgruntled workers to the oligarchs. In many ways, it's a fragile alliance. I mean, how can you create this cross-class coalition between workers and business elites, right? So it's a fragile one, but it's working because, again, some of the problems with the liberal alternative, but also because of the dynamics that we have been discussing, how economic nationalism emerges as a solution that is appealing to both business elites and appealing both to large segment of workers. Trump's favorite word is tariffs. That might be appealing to a lot of businesses, but also a lot of workers in these industrializing areas. It's not a long-term economic solution, but this kind of veneer of economic nationalism helps to keep this otherwise fragile coalition together. And I think identifying ways to break up that coalition is important. But this also, again, means a shift in the way we think about democracy, and think about democracy as a result of competing social forces coming together in a grand compromise. And it's not just about institutions, it's not just about values, it's about organized social coalitions, right? That's really important to identify those social coalitions and try to break up some of them and put together new progressive or liberal and democratic majoritarian social coalitions.
Well, Gábor Scheiring, thank you for your wisdom, for your practical advice, and thank you for joining me here on The Context.
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's really important to have these kind of transatlantic dialogues about democracy. It's a mutual learning process, and I hope it was sobering enough, but not completely disempowering, but rather empowering.
The Context is a production of the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. Our producers are George Drake Jr. and Emily Vaughn. Melinda Gilmore is our Director of Communications. The rest of our team includes Jamal Bell, Teo Clyburn, Jasmine Olari, and Darla Minnick. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another conversation about democracy. In the meantime, visit our website, kettering.org, to learn more about the Foundation or to sign up for our newsletter. If you have comments for the show, you can reach us at thecontext@kettering.org. If you like the show, leave us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, or just tell a friend about us. I'm Alex Lovit. I'm a senior program officer and historian here at Kettering. Thanks for listening. The views expressed during this program are critical to us having a productive dialogue, but they do not reflect the views or opinions of the Kettering Foundation. The Foundation's broadcast and related promotional activities should not be construed as an endorsement of its content. The Foundation hereby disclaims liability to any party for direct, indirect, implied, punitive, special, incidental, or other consequential damages that may arise in connection with this broadcast, which is provided as is and without warranties.